4 United States presidents and their decisions in regard to Japan. By 1850, the American people were in a frenzy about what was termed manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the notion that it was the manifest destiny of the United States to eventually expand and fill the entire North American continent. It began with the annexation of Texas in 1845, and it continued on with the Mexican War, after which we annexed all the southwestern states. Thereafter, we grabbed California from Mexico, and the next step in our manifest destiny mood was towards overseas expansionism, specifically trade in the Pacific. At the same time, in the 1850s, the steamship had been perfected, and it was a number of steamship merchants who said, why don't we have trade with Asia? The government was already subsidizing 4 steamship lines in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean, but if American steamships sailing out of San Francisco could reach Shanghai, Singapore, our merchant ships would steal the entire tea trade from the British, because the British had to go all the way around South Africa, and it took them 80 days to make a trip, and we could steal that tea trade from the British. The British, by the way, knew this was going on, and they immediately nipped it in the bud by digging and completing the Suez Canal in 1867. But our problem with the merchant fleet going to the Pacific was steamships needed coaling stations. Now, we already had a coaling station in Hawaii. That was easy. But we needed another one because there was 4,700 miles to go between Hawaii and Shanghai. Well, that's too long to go without coaling. So what's right in the way? Well, Japan was right in the way. Everybody said, well, why don't we use Japan? They said, we don't know, because we don't know anything about Japan. It is a closed book. It's been a closed book for 250 years. Well, in 1852, the President of the United States was Millard Fillmore. Now, don't expect to see Millard Fillmore's face up on Mount Rushmore anytime soon. He was not a notable president. He was one of the 3 so-called dough-face presidents. The other 2 were Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. They were called dough-face presidents because they did absolutely nothing to stop the onset of the Civil War. Fillmore selected Commodore Matthew Perry to undertake a ticklish mission to Japan. Matthew Perry, by the way, is a brother of Oliver Hazard Perry, the fellow who won the Battle of Put in Bay in the War of 1812. The Japanese had opened their country for a brief time in the 16th century, but they were so annoyed by foreign missionaries and so cheated by foreign traders that they simply slammed the door again. Perry's delicate job was to open the door once again to Japan without starting a war. At this time, Japan was probably the most civilized, the most urbanized, the most literate and peaceful country in the world. But of course, nobody knew it because they were so closed in. Tokyo at this time, the 1850s, has a population of 1 million. At the same time, Washington, D.C. has a population of 30,000. But the national law in Japan forbade a Japanese person to leave the country, and they forbade anyone to come into the country. The penalty was death in both cases. So, in July of 1853, 4 United States Navy ships with state-of-the-art civilization and state-of-the-art 61 cannons bristling entered Tokyo Bay. The Japanese were not even aware of the existence of steam engines at this time, and suddenly these black ships were right there in front of them. Japanese had no army, no navy, no defense. They lined the water in Tokyo Bay, believe it or not, armed with longbows. I'm going back to the Renaissance. The local officials immediately ordered Perry to get out of the bay, but he simply ignored them. He carried a letter from President Fillmore all the way up to the head of the Tokyo Bay. The letter was from Fillmore to the Emperor, and it was delivered. They promised to come back the next year. They did. But it was for the United States a huge success, and of course for our commercial lobbyists who still wanted this trade route to China. But don't think that it was a good neighbor thing, as I've been taught as a young person. It was not. It was very pragmatic. They wanted to open more trade routes. The Japanese were stunned at how far they had fallen in 250 years of closed doors. They immediately set about building an army and a navy, and in a matter of only 40 years, Japan had become an aggressor nation. They invaded China, occupied Korea, and got in a war with Russia. So now the next president, the second president who's going to impact on Japan, is Teddy Roosevelt. Japan attacked Russia in 1904 and surprised international observers. They stunned the world by beating the Russians. They won one battle after another, and Roosevelt himself was fascinated with Japan. He once wrote to his son, he said, "I admire those Japanese and I'm pleased by their Japanese victory." Ironically, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize by mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. He did this by dividing up substantial chunks of Asia and creating a great deal of trouble. He allowed Japan to annex Korea, which half a century later contributed to our own war with Korea in 1950. But Roosevelt's high-handedness in regard to the Japanese thoroughly offended the Japanese people. The third president who's going to impact on Japan, who undertook critical decision-making vis-a-vis Japan, was Franklin Roosevelt. Japanese-American relations were bad in the 1930s, and they worsened when Japan fired on a U.S. warship, the Pan A, in 1937. But we weren't going to go to war over that. But Roosevelt really disliked the Japanese. He really liked Chiang Kai-shek. He loaned money to Chiang Kai-shek, to the government of China, and then he began to ban exports to Japan of U.S. goods that eventually included gasoline, scrap iron, and crude oil. By 1941, it was more than apparent that war with Japan was coming. It came, as we all know, on December the 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. However, according to historian Kenneth Davis, there is no longer any doubt that some Americans knew that the planned attack was scheduled for December 7th, and they already knew that it was going to come at Pearl Harbor. According to The Day of Infamy, that book by John Toland,